Good morning, President Hernandez, members of the board, Dr. Favela. My name is Ed Dawson, and it is my pleasure to tape for you this webinar on the Title I federal programs. I know that we have seen this live at a board meeting, but we wanted to make sure that we had this for posterity's sake and also in order for people, if they wanted to go back and review it, that they certainly can. So what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at three major areas of Title I. First, we're going to look at how it originated and where it came from and why it became a federal entitlement program. The second, then, we're going to look at how the process of allocating the funds occurs from the State Department to the districts and then from the districts into the schools. In the last part of the presentation, we will look at exactly how the fiscal year 15 Title I budget is being allocated at Sunnyside. As this first slide indicates, the department that I'm in, which is the Department of Federal Programs, has a motto. And that mantra is, we become what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. And that's very important, especially in a department like ours, in which we are dealing with approximately $14 million worth of federal and some state program monies. We need to assure, and we have a dedication to our students, that because the students have generated the money, it is our duty to make sure that it's spent in the most appropriate way so that they can have increased opportunities for learning. The history of Title I has been varied, but it really boils back down to Lyndon Baines Johnson. Back in the early 60s, being a president that came from a world of poverty, he enacted his War on Poverty. And within that War on Poverty came the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, otherwise known as ESEA. Now, just as a side note, back in 2001, President Bush retitled that into the No Child Left Behind, but since the new administration came in, they removed the No Child Left Behind, and it is once again known as the ESEA. And it had one primary objective, and that was to close the skill gap on the one thing that research shows creates the biggest gap between children, and that is income. So the Title I money was designated to help close the skill gap in reading and writing and math between the students who lived in the rural areas and those in the suburbs. And it's important to note that this money was to be used for public and for private schools, even though it's the public schools that monitor the money. And as we do at Sunnyside, we monitor the child's money that goes to the private schools as well. So how is it determined? Well, at the national level, every 10 years, there is a census taken. 2010, of course, was our last one. And they use a formula, hence the term of formula grant, of the number of children ages 5 to 17 in families of poverty. And they use other indicators, number of school-aged children, population, children in neglected and delinquent homes. And they come up with a formula for Sunnyside, or for each district boundary. And from the 2010 census, which actually we started seeing the effects of it back in 2012-13. As of this point, Sunnyside, within our district, has received a 16% increase in federal funding from fiscal year 13. Back at that time, it was a little bit over 7,000, and now it's over 9,000 in just a few years. What happens then is that money that's generated by the districts are then scooped up by the State Department at ADE. They take a little bit off the top for administrative expenses, and they allocate the remainder to the districts. So who gets the money? Well, Title I funds go to schools that have at least a 40% free and reduced lunch school-wide. Now, all of our schools are over 70%, but it cannot go to schools that have less than 40% free and reduced. And as on top of that, schools that are between 40 and 75%, of which Sunnyside has some, are eligible but are not required to receive the funding if that's determined by the district. And so you know that there are two types of Title I schools, and you'll see that. There are targeted assistance schools, where the money that goes to the schools are used for a specific group, population, grade level, or school-wide, where all students are eligible for services. And all of Sunnyside schools are school-wide. So what then happens when we get the money? Well, we got our $9 million in, and the first thing that I do is that I make sure that all of our district programs are funded. Now, by district programs, we're talking about our peer engagement initiatives, certain parents as teachers programs, Ocotillo Preschool, College Academy for Parents, and then all the personnel that are at the district level, our district math coordinators, the folks in my office, my salaries. And then the remainder, since that's what is called off the top, it's cut off a little bit on your slide there. But number 2 happens, and that is the remainder then is allocated for school use as opposed to district-wide use. Now, before the schools actually get their funding, we do another round of setting things off the top. So we do a set-aside in our district, in the Sunnyside district, while we then assure that all of our elementary schools and all of our middle schools have the same type of personnel. And that's our technology coaches, our ITCs, our PIAs, our parent involvement assistants, and for the elementary schools, all of the instructional aides. And then, once all that is taken off the top, the remainder then is allocated to the sites. The sites then purchase their personnel, and then any remaining money they propose to our office, as well as to curriculum instruction, how they want to use the remaining funds. So how do I do that? Well, there's a formula that we have to use at the district level, and that is that we need to distribute to the schools their share, and their share is determined by 2 things: their level of free and reduced percentage from the 100th day last year, as well as their school enrollment as of 100th day last year. So in Sunnyside, we've always adopted the fact of tiering our schools, and tiering our schools, as you see on here, from 70 to 79, 80 to 89, and 90 to 100. Then with that bulk of money that's remaining, I use a formula to do a per pupil allocation for each tier. And there's, up to 5 or 6 schools within each tier. The one ruling that we have to do is that for the higher poverty level schools, the one with the higher free and reduced lunch, we have to give a higher per pupil allocation to our 90 to 100, and then less down, and then less down. Now, just so this is on record, we don't have to tier our schools. Sunnyside has traditionally always tiered their schools. We could go school by school and give per pupil allocations to each one, but that doesn't seem to be as efficient as grouping schools together. So what are the allowable Title I expenses? Well, of course, personnel. Close to 90% of all Title I money is spent on personnel, whether that's at the district level, but primarily at the site level. Classroom materials, parent engagement, which is one of the major areas of Title I, extended day, such as after-school programs, before-school programs, Saturday programs, stipends for teachers that work additional hours or that are working on professional development. Of course, professional development, travel. Another mandate is the homeless, or what is the McKinney-Vento program, and then all those administrative expenses that I said in order to manage this. When we work with the schools, which is something that everybody should always take into consideration, is when they want to know if you can spend money, Title I money, on something, the big question is, would you purchase this? Now, this can be, would you purchase this person? Would you purchase, this program or whatever, even if you didn't have Title I funds? And if the answer is, well, yes, our students need it, or our teachers need it, or we wouldn't function as a school, then Title I is not an appropriate funding source. Then it's a district responsibility. If the answer is no, then we can consider whether or not Title I should be the funding source. So let's take a look at our fiscal year 15 allocation. The total amount, as you see on the screen, is $9 million and change. And of that $9 million and change, 26% of it, or a little over $2 million, is spent on those areas that you see, which we call that district set-aside, that first level. So my office, the budget analysts, secretaries, and you can see the list that goes down, our math coordinators, some secretaries, Title II secretary, interesting because you can't use Title II to have clerical staff, so we pay that out of Title I. Some intervention licenses, AVID support, family literacy, as well as the remainder to the private schools. So 74% actually go directly to our schools for support. Now, of that amount that goes to the schools, which is a little about $6.5 million, we then do that second layer of set-aside that I talked about. We do our ITCs, our IAs, and this time we're at 150 to 1, which is good because we've had an increase in funding, and then our PIAs. As you can see then, 65% of what is then remaining, $4,337,000, go directly to our schools. Now within that budget, $3,451,552 of what we just looked at, or 80% of that fund, actually go for the schools to purchase their personnel. And as you can see here, we have program facilitators, our academic interventionists, and in the high schools, because they're so large and they do actually have quite a bit more money, they buy lead academic interventionists, their own tech coaches, data mentors, their PIAs, and their Reading Plus teachers. And in the middle schools, their Read 180 teachers. Out of this budget, out of the site budgets, also come their AVID tutors. So the final total discretionary funds that go to sites is about $876,000. And by discretionary, I mean after you've paid for all the people, then that's how much money the schools collectively have. But each school has a little bit different. Some have more, of course, than others, to buy materials to support their school improvement plan. Even though that was a very quick way of looking at Title I, it's important to know that the Federal Programs Office actually has quite a few grants that we manage. I know that many of you have already seen the webinar that's on Title II and Title III. So this Title I actually will fill out the larger entitlement webinars, but we'll also be doing some more webinars on other ones. But just so that you get an idea, in this year, the Department of Federal Programs is managing a little over $14 million worth of grants. The 3 major titles plus Move On When Reading, which is actually an M&O grant. Our 21st Century grant, which there'll be a webinar coming up soon on that. The Focus School grants, the Challenger School Improvement Grant, which is about $1 million a year. The First Things First grant through the Parents as Teachers program. We have an additional blended learning. Our Race to the Top, which is used to support our Common Core, and of course our McKinney-Vento grant, which we received one more time, of which we have yet to fail to get it. So we've got one more time, 3 years for $100,000 each. And none of that would be possible to manage any of that unless we had an outstanding team. And we certainly do have an outstanding team with Andrea Foster as my right-hand person. And the list, as you can see here, from Erica, Joan Katz as Parents as Teachers, the new member, Vanessa Gomes, who is going to be our 21st Century Specialist, Mian, and everybody in the Parents as Teachers, our wonderful secretarial support with Sandra, Hans Schott, who is also one of the wonderful data and assessment people, and of course me. So thank you very much for this time. In order to take a look at Title I, we're very proud of what we do in Title I. We're very proud of the fact that we do what is right, work with the teachers, we work with the principals, we work with the district and school leadership to make sure that all of